Software, and I'd like to welcome each of you to the webinar on the new payroll module. This is a payroll module that we put out with this most recent update, and we want to walk you quickly through the setup and use of this new payroll system. That we currently have 3 different options for payroll. We have the very original payroll system that we put in place, and then we updated that for agencies who needed more advanced schedule validation on their payroll system. And now with this new update, we've really laid the foundation for a lot of really sophisticated payroll capabilities, both now and in the future. One of the great benefits of the new payroll module is its capability of tracking payroll activities for your schedules, as well as your task and timesheets and expenses and even salary staff. And so we want to walk you through each of those topics this morning so that you can see exactly how to set up the payroll module and then to use it to its maximum advantage. So first things first, in order to turn on the new payroll module, we are asking that you do 2 things. One is before you get started using the payroll module, because it is so advanced and complex, we do ask that you set up a time with our support staff to actually walk you through the setup of your payroll module. And so if you want to start using the payroll module after we get finished up with this webinar, if you will either call in or send a support ticket to our support team, we will schedule a time to work with you to actually set up your payroll data files and get you set up in the system to start using payroll. But once you do, there are a few things in the system that control your use of the payroll module. And so let's look through just a few of those real quickly. Under your administration company settings, there is a components tab, and there are a few things that could affect your potential payroll usage. The first is the timesheets component, and this is the component that controls how your office employees are able to log timesheets or activity within the software. If you want to run your office staff payroll through the HealthTrust software system, and you'll want to turn on this timesheet option. Now you have 3 options here, do not use, which would obviously turn the feature off completely. But you have 2 features if you want to turn them on. One is the timesheet view, and this is very similar to having your employees fill out a timesheet at the end of the week or at the end of the day, where they tell you what hours they work. They would be able to put in that they started at 8 o'clock, that they finished at 5 o'clock p.m., and that they took an hour for lunch or an hour for break. The log-in, log-out option controls actually forcing them to clock in and clock out, very much like a punch sheet or a timesheet entry at a factory, where they actually have to log in at a given time. And to do that, they would simply click the clock in button at the top of the screen, and it would tell them that they've now clocked in for the day. And of course, when they finish up in the afternoon, they'll be able to click the button again to clock out. And so that gives you more fine-grained control over the exact minute and second that someone punched in or punched out of work, but it also comes with the added overhead of making sure that people are actually punching in and punching out as they should. In addition to that, there is another component that is just simply called payroll, and to access it you have similarly 3 options here: the do not use, which will turn payroll off, version 2012, which is the current version within the software, and then you have what we are now releasing as the current version. This would put you in the most up-to-date payroll module, and that's just simply by selecting current version. Once that has been turned on, the second thing you'll want to make sure of is that your group settings give you access to the payroll capabilities that you're expecting. We have added in, underneath the payroll section, the payroll menu, the capability of view, add, edit, and void actual payroll runs. And then we also have the ability to approve schedules, timesheets, tasks, and expenses before they're ever allocated to payroll. This gives you the capability of having your individual branch offices, maybe an administrator or a scheduler or a case manager at those offices. You may want to have them approve of the schedules before they go to your corporate office for payroll processing. And so in order to do that, you can simply turn on the approval mechanism by setting up your group settings under the payroll menu. And then this last option, this group is allowed to set up and modify payroll features. This would be the actual company setup of your payroll program. And so you want to guard that very closely. And just so it's clear while we're on this particular topic, while we're under group settings, another feature that you want to make sure that you have fine-grained control over is under the reference menu, under your agents menu. You have several options here. One of these is this group is allowed to see agent financial information. This controls who is allowed to see your employees' payroll rates, their pay rates, and their other financial information. So make sure you guard that particular setting with care. And then in order to give agencies the capability of even further refinement of that, we've added another option that says this group is allowed to see agent high security pay rate information. We added this option because very often agencies want their payroll department or their managers to be able to get in and see pay rates for their employees, but they want to really protect the pay rates and financial information of their management or ownership. So in order to do that, you can give your payroll staff or your office staff the capability of seeing agent financial information, but take away their capability of seeing the agent high security pay rate information. And then under the agent screen for your high-level employees, you can simply select the high security option on the agent screen, and that will put them into kind of a high restriction or high security clearance group, so that only people who have this high security clearance access are able to see those particular employee accounts. And so that's your group setting. Like I said, make sure that you guard that with care, that you understand what each of those settings controls throughout the software. Okay, now the other thing that you'll need to set up before you move further is after you've turned on the new payroll module, we will need to go through and actually conduct a payroll setup. Again, we're laying the foundation for a much bigger and more robust payroll module over the next several months, and so you'll kind of see those things set up even now. So you have really three payroll setup activities that need to take place. The first is your company defaults. You can get to that by going to Payroll Setup, click on the Company Default tab or link, and that'll bring up a pop-up window. And that gives you the capability of saying who you want to create a payroll for. This is the payroll setup, and that's going to be for all home health agencies, that's going to be based upon a company. The individual providers option are for agencies who conduct consumer-directed services capabilities, and that's really outside the scope of this particular webinar. So for all of you, the create payroll is going to be per company. You'll put in your company information as you would like it to appear within your payroll processing department. So when we run reports or when we do exports of your payroll information, we want to know what company information you would like to see printed out on those reports. So basic information there. And then under the settings, I want you to pay close attention to this, especially if you export files to ADP or to PayChoice or to some other payroll processor, or if you want to tie your payroll expenses back out to a particular category. For instance, ADP would have cost allocation codes that determine where expenses get allocated within your financial statements. The system is being set up in the future to have a full payroll module with check printing capabilities, etc. And so this controls in the current system, the system that you'll be using when you turn this module on, these settings control what will show up on your export options, and they also control the actual pay rates that will be paid at any given time. In the future, these will actually control a lot of your ledger and general ledger account information. So when you're setting that up, one of the things you have the capability of controlling is which company or which provider account we allocate payroll expenses to. This is beneficial for those of you with multiple locations where you share employees between locations. So if you have employee A who happens to work sometimes in your branch location A, but then they also work and share time in branch location B, you can choose to allocate all of their cost to branch location A, or you may choose to have their cost allocated to whichever patients providers that they're seeing. So if they're seeing patients from branch A, then all of the cost associated with that visit will be allocated to branch A. If they see patients from branch B, the allocation for those visits is going to go to branch B. So in order to set that up, the default is by patient's provider, meaning we're going to allocate as often as possible when you conduct for your schedules and your even some of your tasks that are assigned to a patient, we will allocate the cost to the provider that's assigned to that patient. Otherwise, you can choose to use the agent's default provider, and regardless of which patient is seen by that particular employee, we're always going to pay and allocate the payroll expenses to the individual agent's provider account. Then you have the option of choosing how we calculate overtime. The default is the blended rate, which is in general the one that's most likely to be used. I would only change that to maximum rate if you really have a reason for doing that. Blended rate overtime calculation means that if an employee works 10 hours at $12 an hour and 10 hours at $10 an hour, and they carry that on throughout their payroll period, when they start to work overtime, we will make a calculation that blends those rates together based upon the number of hours that they worked at each of those rates. And so their overtime rate will actually be a blended rate of their normal pay rates. Again, that's the most common overtime calculation, and so we definitely recommend that you leave that turned on. However, if you would like to pay your employees, for instance, maybe they work 40 hours at one rate, and then after working 40 hours, you want to pay them for doing a different job, and so they need to be paid all overtime rates at that particular job rate, then you could turn that on to the maximum rate. But again, blended rate is by far the most common and the most conventional payroll overtime methodology to use. Categorize wage expenses. This option allows you, again, if you're exporting to ADP or to PayChoice, and later on when we allocate your general ledger accounts, if you want your wage expenses to be categorized based upon the service that's actually being performed, which is the most common option, then you just choose by service or by task. Otherwise, you can actually set up all of your wage expenses to go to an individual employee. The by service task option gives you the capability of splitting out your payroll based upon the type of service that's being rendered. So if you wanted to know how much pay you gave for OASIS admission visits versus routine skilled nursing visits, or the difference between therapy evaluations and routine therapy notes, then this setting here would actually control those wage expense categorizations for you. The other thing we definitely need to know is when your payroll week begins. Of course, that defaults Sunday through Saturday, but sometimes you may need to change that if necessary. We also can start calculating your weekend differentials as well as your first, second, and third shift pay differentials. So if you pay employees a bonus for working overnight or for working a second shift or for working on a weekend, then we need to know when your weekend begins. And so you may want to say that it begins on Friday afternoons at 5 o'clock, and it's going to end on Monday morning at 7 o'clock in the morning, then any hours worked between 5 p.m. on Friday and 7 a.m. on Monday morning are going to receive whatever weekend bonus you set up at the individual employee level. The same thing under your first shift, second shift, and third shift. You can tell us when each of those shifts begin. So a typical first shift would be something like 7 o'clock in the morning until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Your second shift may be 3 to 11, and then the third shift would be 11 p.m. until 7 a.m. the next morning. If you only run 2 shifts, let's say you run 7 o'clock in the morning until 7 o'clock at night, using your first shift differentials, then you would want to skip down to your third shift and go ahead and set that up as 7 o'clock at night until 7 o'clock the next morning. And the system will, again, make those wage adjustments or those shift differentials based upon the times that you've set up in this particular location. Again, we bring that up simply for your reference information in case later on you want to go back and make those changes. But for now, before you actually get started using the software, we would ask that you call in and schedule an appointment with our support team to walk you through each of these components and make sure those are set up correctly. The second thing you need to set up, which is already available under our company settings page, would be your company holidays. So if you pay a holiday bonus to any of your staff, office staff, or field staff, we need to know about that so we can calculate those holiday bonuses. In order to do that, click the holiday link, click Add Holiday, type in the holiday name, and then tell us what the date and time that holiday starts and ends. So we would need that filled out as well, and just hit the Submit button to add extra holidays into the system. And then a new feature that controls the actual pay runs will be the pay periods. And this is it's a notion that you need to be very familiar with. A pay period effectively establishes to us how often you pay your employees. And you can set up multiple pay periods. So if you pay your clinical staff every 2 weeks, but you pay your office staff every week, then you would set up 2 pay periods very similar to this, one that's paid every week and one that's paid every 2 weeks. You may also pay some of your staff on a bi-monthly basis. You would need to set up a pay period for that. So to begin, just click the Add Pay Period option. You're going to give the pay period a title, which is how we will reference this later on. So if we have a bi-monthly pay period, what we need you to tell us is when, based upon the current day, when your next payday would be. So if we're going to run bi-monthly, meaning we're going to pay on the 1st and the 16th, then I would say that my next pay period is going to be June the 16th. I want to tell us what dates of service or expenses or task this is going to cover. So if for your June 16th pay period, you cut off visits, so visits had to have been performed by, let's just look here, on June the 16th, that's going to be a Sunday. So let's say we only pay on the 16th for visits that were turned in by the previous Friday, which would be June 14th. So we'll put that in. And then we'll also need to know the confirmation dates associated with that. So if they can turn in notes up through the 14th, but they have to be confirmed in the system by that the day before payroll, then what will happen is even if someone turns in a visit note that was conducted on the 13th, so the date of service would be the 13th, but it didn't get through your care validation team until the 16th, it would not be included in your next pay run. So make sure you set those dates up correctly. Tell us whether this is a default schedule or not, meaning this is the schedule you want to use for most of your employees when they first are entered into the system. And then if this payroll is limited to a particular branch office, then you can set that up. Most of the time that would be unnecessary. Most companies want to run one payroll for their entire company. because we will allocate the cost amongst the different providers automatically. But if for some reason you want to run multiple payrolls, then you could set one for each branch office, then you do have the capability of setting that up as well. All right, so that's your company setup. The next thing we need to make sure that we do is set up each of our employees to use the new payroll features. And so to do that, we would go to HR Agents. If you have the HR module turned on. If you don't have the HR module turned on, your Agents link will be found underneath the Reference menu. But underneath, under a typical setting, underneath your HR menu, you can go into a particular agent account, and most of their information is being controlled underneath the Financial tab. And again, this is being able to view the Financial tab is controlled by your group settings. And so you have three tasks here, or three tabs that are listed out. One would be your current financial tab, which tells us the status of the employee. One thing to note about this particular status is that we will only include in payroll employees who are currently active. So if you set an employee to on leave, resigned, terminated, inactive, or void, even if they have visit information in the system, those will not pull to your payroll program. And so you want to make sure that you don't inactivate the status of the employee. Now, you can turn off their access to the software system. You can turn off their ability to be scheduled for future visits, but don't change their financial status until they've been completely through all of your, your payroll processing. The other field that could control some of your payroll activity would be the overtime threshold. By default, that's set to 40 hours a week. There are certain states and certain situations where an overtime threshold may be 48 hours a week, such as some attendant care situations. And so if that's the case, if the overtime threshold is something different than 40 hours a week, you would want to put that in. And then you'd want to tell us whether the employee is approved to work overtime or not. Underneath then your payroll tab, this is where we talked about earlier the ability to set up an employee as a high security permission employee. So your managers or owners, you may want to have on their accounts this box checked so that only people with high security clearance can view their payroll information. If you export files, your payroll information to ADP, PayChoice, etc., then you would want to make sure that you say to include this employee in your exports. You would want to set up a payroll ID number for that employee. This will export on your ADP exports. Later on, it will be used in your payroll calculations and paycheck printing through the software. Payroll Department is, again, another code that you can use to allocate the expenses for this employee. So if you have payroll departments in your general ledger, like in QuickBooks, where you have maybe a nursing department or a therapy department, or you may have a pediatric department versus a geriatric department, in those situations you would enter in your QuickBooks code or your general accounting ledger code here. So let's say that you have maybe a nursing department. We may want to put our code as nursing, or in some other systems that may be something like nursing 10011. Again, that's completely dependent upon your general ledger and accounting system. Our payroll ID is going to be an identification number for this particular employee. So we'll just set that to a random number for now. The payroll account is used only when expenses are going to be tracked to the individual employee's account. So if you want all shift differentials and all scheduled payments to be allocated to this particular agent's account in your general ledger, if you have an expense account set up for that particular agent only, then you could put in that agent code here or that payroll account code here. Again, most of the time that's not the case because people want their services allocated to the service level, but again, it depends completely upon your general ledger accounting setup. You do need to select the default payroll employer or the default payroll provider. This is the company that will be assigned or allocated all of the expenses for this employee when the other criteria isn't in effect. For instance, under our company settings, we said to allocate all expenses based upon the patient's office. So if the patient is in branch A and we see that patient, all of those visit costs will be allocated to branch A. When we see patient B who's at branch office B, those expenses are allocated to branch office B. But there are times where we don't have a provider allocated to a particular task, such as obviously when employees are paid by salary, they're not necessarily seeing patients. We need all of that salary expense allocated to a particular office. Whenever they have case conferences or meetings or continuing education classes, paid time off, all of those types of activities aren't allocated to a particular patient and therefore can't be tracked back to a particular office. In those cases, the cost will be allocated to whoever this default employer, or again, this is based upon the labels that you set up at your company. So this may say employer, it may say branch office, it may say provider, which is the default label here. But based upon this default payroll provider field is where your costs will be allocated when we can't make a determination based upon the patient. And then you will assign this employee to a particular payroll period. So those payroll periods that we've set up earlier, we would need to allocate which one of those this employee gets paid based on. Okay. And then the last tab is your employee pay rates. The system has a very robust way of tracking pay rates. You can track and give employees different pay based upon a number of criteria. Let's just look at some of those. You can pay your employees different rates based upon the activities that they perform, the types of services that they perform. So if you want to pay an employee, let's say $100 a visit for making a skilled nursing oasis visit, an admission visit, then you could set up that admission visit here, and we would put in $100 per visit and hit the submit button. If you wanted to go even further than that, let's say you wanted to pay the employee $100 per visit, but we also want to pay them for travel time, or we want to pay them for their mileage at, let's say, 45 cents per mile, then we could just type that amount in. If we wanted to be even more complex and say we want to pay them $100 per visit, but if they're working at night or if they work on a weekend, I'm going to go ahead and give them an extra $10 per visit. So if they get called out on the weekend, they automatically get a weekend bonus associated with that visit. So again, based upon the weekend times and dates that you set up under your company settings, we can automatically allocate a weekend bonus to this employee. And you can even mix and match the types of bonuses that you give. So if you want to say that we pay this employee $100 per visit, but if they work on a weekend, we're actually going to give them another $2 per hour that they're in the home. You can actually do that. So if this employee works on a Saturday and they make a visit that takes them 3 hours, they're actually going to be paid $106 for that visit plus 45 cents a mile for their travel, their actual mileage. If you wanted to, you would save that, and if you wanted to set up another pay rate for routine visits, then you could just simply select the routine service code and fill out the pay rate that's associated with it. If you wanted to allocate pay rates based upon an individual patient that an employee sees, you could set that up by just simply selecting who the patient is. In many situations, especially with attendant care, CBA, the PCS type arrangements, there are some states that have different pay rates that they will pay the agency if the employee is related to the patient. And so sometimes agencies want to pay the employee differently if they're related to the patient or not. And so in those cases, we will actually tell you if the patient and employee are related based upon the related patients or related agents section on the patient screen. But you can allocate a particular pay rate based upon the patient who's being served by selecting patient here. Additionally, for any of the tasks, so your meetings, your phone calls, for your marketing department or your office staff or even your clinical staff, when they come in and conduct a case conference or a training or even an orientation, and you want to pay them a particular rate for their orientations, you can do that. Simply select from the task category, and you do control these task categories underneath your attributes under the reference files. But let's say you want to actually pay for in-services at, you're going to just do a default rate of $10 per hour for this particular employee. Well, anytime they log a task that's an in-service category, then for the payroll section, we'll allocate $10 an hour for that employee's pay rates. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is generally you would want to set up your first pay rate as a default pay rate, meaning you don't want it allocated to a patient or a service or a task. You just want to set up the default pay rate for that employee, which means that if we don't have another pay rate that matches for the employee, then we're going to pay them this default rate. That usually makes it easier so that you only have to set up additional pay rates for ones that don't match the default. So if the default is to pay an employee $15 per hour with a certain weekend bonus or even a holiday bonus, let's say you may want to pay them an extra 50% if they work on a weekend, then you can do that. And the only time you would need to set up a second pay rate is if this $15 an hour with a 50% holiday bonus does not cover that particular situation. So hopefully that's pretty clear. Again, you can set up some really complex and complicated pay rate methodologies here, but it gives you a lot of flexibility and a lot of power. And then the other thing to mention before we leave this screen is that underneath the status, if you give an employee a pay raise, or if you change their pay rates for any particular time period, you can go in and inactivate a particular pay status, or you can just simply set the active dates. So if an employee was paid this $15 an hour, but it's only effective up until June 1st, then you can simply put in the effective through date and then add a second pay rate that would include their raise. And on that one, you would put the active date starting on June the 2nd. And so any visits that occur after June the 2nd would be paid at this new pay rate. Anything June 1st and back would be paid at the $15 an hour pay rate. So again, a lot of flexibility and customization that you can set up there, and we'll be more than happy to help you get those things set up in the beginning as you transition to this new payroll module. All right, let's look just at a couple more reference files before we move on. One that you'll want to take into account is under your reference attributes section. You do have the capability of setting up attributes for your task categories. These are the categories that we saw earlier just a second ago on the pay rate screen. So if you wanted to set up an orientation task and pay your employees based upon that orientation, you could do that. The reason I bring up this particular section as unique is because you saw as soon as I selected the task category option, it expanded to give me this additional payroll information. Under the pay rate section that we saw a minute ago, that is only applicable to one individual employee. And so if you want to set up an orientation pay policy that affects just one employee, then you'll want to set it up under the agent pay rate section. But a lot of agencies have default pay rates that they pay for all employees. So all employees who come on board with an orientation program, or maybe jury duty would be a good setting. If you say most companies would have a jury duty policy where they say something like, we're going to pay you $12, and here you can set it up as if it's per hour or per occurrence. So if you pay them $12 a day for their jury duty time, then you could just simply set up $12 per occurrence, and that will go into effect for all employees unless overridden by an agent pay rate policy. Okay, so this would be a blanket jury duty pay policy unless you set up a jury duty policy for an individual employee. It would override this here on a global basis. And just like before, you have a payroll code and a payroll department for when we export these to ADP or to your general ledger accounting system. You would have the capability of tracking codes that go along with these task categories as well. All right. Let's look at the actual payroll process now. Now that we have most of our setup behind us, let's look at how payroll is actually, what it gets pulled from. And again, there are 5 different sections that we would include in payroll. The first would be our salary employees, and that simply comes from any employee who has a pay rate that's set to pay by salary that's active during the pay run that we're about to run. And so you've seen how those are set up. The most common item that's going to go on your payroll would be a charge or a visit. So when you go to a particular charge, let's look at this one here. That was this is a visit that was scheduled for, let's do June the 5th, scheduled for Nurse RN. When we look at her particular schedule, she was scheduled to work overnight, so she was working on June the 5th through June the 6th, working 4 o'clock in the afternoon through 6 o'clock the next morning. As this visit gets finished up, so once it gets through our point of care program, or if they've turned in a hard copy note and we confirm this visit, that does a couple of things. One is it confirms it for billing, so when our billers run their claims, this charge will now be included most likely on a claim that's coming up. But the other thing it does is it sets it up to be approved within our default payroll process. I bring this up because I also want you to see underneath the payroll tab, there are some items available here that generally you would leave alone, that we will set automatically. The first is your payroll status field. And you can see right now it's blank, meaning that this visit has never been included. It's never been approved for payroll. It's never been included on a payroll run, which is to be expected because we just now confirmed it. Now what's going to happen is as it goes through the approval and the payroll process, you will see this status get automatically updated for you. Now we have this drop-down box on the charge screen so that you can change that information, but that should happen very, very rarely. And so if you do change that, you're going to get a big warning letting you know that most likely you're making a mistake. Again, this should very, very rarely ever be changed, but we do give you the capability of manually adjusting some of the payroll options. More importantly, down here below, you have the capability of setting up payroll items on a charge basis, meaning let's say that you have a payroll or a pay rate set up for this employee where you pay them $50 a visit. But because another nurse called in sick and you had to call this employee while she was supposed to be on vacation, and you've asked her to come out of vacation to handle this particular visit, and you say to her, for this time, if you'll just make this one visit, I'm going to double your pay for this particular visit. Then what you could do is go to this payroll tab, and for this one visit only, you could set a pay rate of $100 per visit. And so this employee now, rather than having her default pay rate go into effect, she's going to get paid $100, no mileage, no travel time, unless, of course, you set that information up here. Another thing you could do in that particular situation is leave all of this blank and just give the employee a bonus of $50. And so that would keep the current pay rate in effect, but in addition to the current pay rate, it would also give her an extra $50 on top of her default pay rate. So again, just wanted you to be aware of those particular settings. The vast majority of the time, you will never need to touch this payroll screen. You should very, very rarely ever be on that payroll screen. That's why it's tucked away over here on these extra tabs. But I wanted you to be aware that just in your general process flow, you are automatically setting visits up to go into your payroll process simply by going through your normal care validation or manual confirmation process for your visits. The other item that's available to you under the payroll program would be your task. So when you set up a task, such as maybe we come into the office and we do an in-office training. Whenever that employee logs that task, they could tell us the date and time that they conducted that task, and we will calculate based upon the time, or they can simply put in the total time. They have to tell us the date that they were there, but if you don't want to put a through date, you can always say, okay, I was here for 4 hours and 15 minutes, and that's what we'll use in the payroll calculation, and then it's based upon this particular category of service. So if I wanted to say it's an in-service, then this employee will get paid for 4 hours and 15 minutes at their normal in-service rate. But again, just like on the charge, we have a payroll tab that does give you the capability of updating this information. So if you wanted to pay them a stipend amount or a bonus amount on top of their normal rate, then you could do that. Simply put in that stipend amount here, and whether that's per hour or per occurrence, you could just give us that information. When you save this this task, that will now be available within our payroll module. The fourth item that's available to go into payroll would be our expenses, and expenses are always associated with a particular task. So once a task has been entered, let's say this employee, they showed up for the in-service, but you asked them to stop by and pick up some Krispy Kremes on the way, then they may turn in an expense sheet where they said, okay, I picked up meals and I spent $35 there. They could even scan in their receipt and put that on this expense tab, and then just hit the submit button. And now when we run payroll, in addition to their 4 hours and 15 minutes of in-service, plus the $50 bonus, plus the $35 in expenses. Okay. And then the last category that we would have available to us within our payroll processing menu is going to be our timesheets or our time clocks. And so just like we did earlier, we punched in. Now whenever I clock out, there's going to be a timesheet record available to me that says that I've worked for, I think today I've worked about 30 minutes based upon this particular webinar. And so I can always go into my my timesheets option, and I can see, okay, on June the 6th, I worked from 10:11 to 10:51, so about 0.65 hours. I can go in and edit that timesheet if I need to change my time, if I have permission to do that under my group settings. But these are the timesheets that would be available for this employee that will show up underneath our payroll module later. So again, 5 things are going to go to payroll by default. That's going to be salaries, charges, task, expenses, and timesheets. And we'll walk through those here in just a second. So now let's start our actual payroll cycle. So let's say today is the day that we're going to run our payroll. We're going to go through a few steps. The first is we want to review and approve each of those items. Now, we don't have to review or approve salaries because that's set up at a company level, But each of the individual tasks and activities that occur, we need to approve those. You can bypass this step and go ahead and just run your payroll if you believe that everything should be paid. But most companies want a type of QA conducted before they run their payroll, and that's what this review approve option gives you. It gives you the ability to have individuals at each of your branch offices actually approve the schedules, and then have one payroll staff at your corporate office run all of your payroll together. It gives you the capability, even if you only have one office, it gives you the capability of having your case managers approve their schedules, or your supervisors approve the schedules of the people they supervise, and then have your payroll department run the entire payroll all at once. So it gives you great flexibility in that regard. So let's walk through a typical example. The first thing I want to do is review and approve my schedules. And this is a feature that's common to many of you who've used our payroll system in the past. It gives you the capability to filter by your provider or employer. You could also filter by the supervisor. So if you're a supervisor and you just want to look at schedules for your employees, then you just select your name here. Any employee that's is supervised by that supervisor is going to show up, and no one else. If you only want to approve a particular employee's schedule, then you could select that. If you only want to approve schedules that occurred before a certain date, then we could do that. So we could enter that into the system as well. Now, most of these defaults are what we would want anyway, but you have the capability of overriding those. There are situations where agencies are either behind on their care validation, or for one reason or another have decided that they want to pay employees even though visits haven't been through the care validation process yet. By default, those visits are excluded, and I typically don't recommend paying employees unless a visit has actually made it through your care validation procedures. If you have an efficient care validation process like we recommend under the compliance complex, you should be able to validate those visits within 24 hours of receipt. If your care validation procedures are taking considerably longer than that, I would recommend as a first step is to make sure that that's where your focus is on getting that care validation process down to be very, very efficient. If you need help with that, we're more than happy to conduct some additional training using the compliance complex. If you haven't read through that compliance complex document that's available for you, we can get you a copy of that and help you walk through that. But your care validation procedures should be very, very efficient. But there are situations, and we understand how life can be, that there are times in reality, and especially during this interim stage as you're transitioning and learning about the care validation procedures, that you may need to pay employees for visits that just haven't been through that care validation procedure yet, or for some other reason have not been confirmed. In those rare instances, you can choose this option of including unconfirmed visits, and that will allow you to go ahead and include in a pay run visits that haven't been confirmed yet. You can also choose to include missed visits. We'll typically exclude those by default, but if you pay employees for missed visits, then you can set that up here as well. Typically, we would recommend that on missed visits, you would allocate your any expenses associated with that on a task sheet, but you do have the capability of including those here. And then by default, we also include all employees and contractors. So if you employ third-party contractors from a therapy staffing company, we can go ahead and run the payroll information directly through the software all at once. Or if you only want to pay in a pay run your particular employees, then you can choose to use agents versus contractors. And then you just hit the submit button. We will then turn around and give you a list. These gray bars will list each individual employee who has visits that are ready to be confirmed or ready to be approved for the payroll process. By default, each of those is checked because we assume that you're going to be paying them for the visits that come through. We give you some default pay rate information and hours. Now, this does not take into account all of the shift differentials, the pay rates for those individual activities. We just want to give you a default information for that patient or that employee so you can see what they could potentially get paid. All of the complex functionality will actually come into play when we run payroll. You can click on the links to pull up that actual visit to get into the details of it. And then when you're done, just simply hit the submit button, and it will give you a link. It tells you that it was successful. The reason we take you to this screen now, and some of you have already turned on the current payroll and you've approved some schedules, or you've come to this screen and it's given you a lot of warnings saying employee A does not have a payroll department or does not have a payroll code. The reason we do that is because we want you to know in advance before you run payroll that if you're using the new version, the current version, that your employees are missing vital information that's needed to run those payroll reports. And so if you get those warnings, just know that we did approve those visits. That wasn't a problem, but we wanted you to be aware of potential problems before you actually run a full payroll. And so if you get those warnings, just look those over and make the appropriate adjustments. In a similar manner, you have the ability to review and approve timesheets. So those will be listed out here. I'm just going to go through very quickly and approve these. Same thing with our task. So there's the in-service that we just created earlier. And then we have the ability of reviewing and approving expenses. Now with expenses, this screen is slightly different because we give you the capability of reviewing first and then approving. Very often, agencies want to have the capability for someone in the office, in the local office, to approve of one of the expenses that comes in, and so they can do that and hit submit. And then someone in your payroll department can come back later and approve those visits for payroll purposes. They have a lookup option to view the task that this expense was created with. And so you can see this was a luncheon where the employee went to Outback Steakhouse, and now we can actually pull up the receipt when that's scanned in to be able to view the receipt of that particular expense that was given. And so once that's done, you can just hit the submit button, and that will go through and approve off those payroll items or those expenses as well. And so once that's done, what we want to do is from the top, we will go to Payroll, Create New Payroll. And that takes you to a screen that looks like this. The first thing you'll notice is that the system is telling me that there are pending payrolls that have not been completed yet. At this point, this is different than what we've done in the past. From this point on, we now actually track each individual pay run that you do. So if you have, if you run 3 different payrolls on the same day, you will have 3 different payroll entries into the software. In the past, we simply kept track of which charges and expenses and tasks were included on a particular payroll date. And just grouped all of those together. Well, now those are grouped actually by a payroll run. So if you've started a payroll run but you've not finished it yet, if you go to create another payroll, it's going to give you a warning that you already have another payroll that started but hasn't been completed. And to get back to that pay run, just simply click the link, and it will drop you back off here and automatically fill in your filter criteria that you've keyed in before. And so you want to choose the payroll period of who you're paying. So if we choose the every 2 weeks option, the only employees who will be included in this are those who have their payroll period set to the every 2 weeks payroll period. You can put in the last date of service and the confirmed date ranges for the visits that we want to pay. Very quickly in the future, we will have those populate for you based upon the information in your company defaults. But for now, you'll need to key in the last date of service and the confirmed dates if you want to limit your pay run to a particular time period. Usually you don't have to do that because by default, we're only including schedules, timesheets, tasks, and expenses that have been approved. So usually under the approval screen, you would put in the date ranges that you want. And then when we come to payroll, the default here is going to run all expenses, all schedules, all timesheets that have been approved at any given point. And of course, you can filter those again by provider or by supervisor, but generally that's not necessary. For the most part, we're just going to leave this as is and hit the Create New Payroll option. It just lets us know that it may take several minutes to complete. We'll just say OK. And the next screen it's going to take us to will be our Payroll Schedules option. And that will give us a list of all of our employees who have visits for this particular pay run. I only have one employee who has any visits now. But you'll see exactly what it does. For each of those visits, it tells us who the patient was with a link. If we click that link, it will take us to the visit details so we can see that. It tells us what type of service was performed, the date of service, the time in and time out. So this employee worked 2 hours. I believe we set them up to get paid $50 an hour. And so you now see that we've allocated out each of the expenses for that particular employee account, so that if we have shift differentials in effect, they could get paid possibly a first shift, second shift, third shift, weekend, night shift on the weekends, or third shift on the weekends, holiday bonuses, general bonuses, mileage pay, or travel time pay, and we will automatically split those out. So if we had 3 hours of third shift time, that would be allocated here. Now, we give you these as text boxes. Again, the vast majority of the time you never have to touch these because the pay rates are calculated very precisely. But if for some reason you need to pay an employee a difference, let's say you didn't set up your bonuses, but for this particular employee you now want to give them a bonus, you can override what we put into the system and just set the $5 bonus up here, and that will go through to our payroll run. And then you just hit the next button, and it's going to walk you through each of those steps that we've included. So it goes through our visits first, and then our timesheets. And so you can see here this employee on 12/21, way back. I haven't run a payroll in 6 months, I guess. But this employee worked for 10 hours on a weekend, and so all of their time was calculated into the weekend bonus time here, and so they made $510 on that weekend. So you can just see how these things are aggregated and calculated. And then we go through the task. So here's our in-service with our bonus time that we allocated earlier. We don't have any expenses that I didn't approve those expenses earlier. I don't have any employees with a salary amount, but if I did, those would be listed out here as well. On salaries, you should note that what we will show, we basically show two categories for salary. We will show the number of hours and the salary calculation amount. If this is if you set the pay run to be every 2 weeks, then it's going to take your yearly salary and divide that by 26. If this employee hasn't worked any other shifts, if it's just pure salary, then we're going to do a default calculation of a number of hours. And so if they're paid salary on a weekly basis, then the hours are going to default to 40. If they're paid on a every other week basis, the hours will default to 80. If they're paid twice a month, I think it defaults to something like 86 hours. But anyway, I want you to be aware of how those are calculated. And then when you click the next button, we will give you a full payroll or pay run, basically a spreadsheet that shows you exactly what's getting paid for each employee. I only have one employee here. Most of you are going to have a list of anywhere from 10 to 100 or 1,000 employees. But this will tell me for each employee how many hours they worked, how much regular time they're being paid, how much first, second, third shift differentials they're being paid, total weekend bonuses, third shift weekend bonuses. If they worked overtime, based upon that overtime threshold calculation, we will automatically show those to you as well. We will automatically calculate their overtime pay based upon that blended rate that we talked about earlier. We would automatically calculate holiday pay, bonuses, mileage, travel time, expense reimbursement, and then we've got some other fields that you'll see coming into effect in the future. Right now we don't calculate federal withholding, Social Security, Medicare, et cetera. You can key those in. We give you those fields now because if you do run your payroll through like a QuickBooks option, you can actually key in the information here, and we will store it so that we have better cost allocation within the software. In the future, we actually expect to make those calculations for you automatically. But right now, you have, excuse me, you have all of these options available to you, and most of these are calculated automatically. And then the last screen that you come to will give you your payroll options. Up to this point, we've actually not affected the system at all. If we don't hit the Save button, then none of those visits, those tasks, those timesheets will be marked as payrolled. They're still set to approved, but they're not actually included on a pay run just yet. So that gives you great flexibility. You can go all the way through to that previous screen, even to this screen. So if you wanted to export to ADP just to get some information or to see how it's going to export, you can do that. And then go back and rerun the payroll, and all of those charges and timesheets will still be there. They only get saved. This payroll run only gets saved when you hit the Save button. Okay, if you forget to hit the Save button when you go back to run your payroll later, you go to create a new payroll, it's going to show you we still have a payroll that's pending. Okay, and just like before, we would have to go back through that payroll run. And this time I'm just going to use all the default options. It would take me right back through here, and then I can go back. Now, as soon as I hit Save, it saves that pay run for me, and those things are locked in place. But on this screen, I have the capability of doing a printout by payer. So for all of the charges that were in the system, if I wanted to see how my payroll stacked up on a payer-by-payer basis, I could do that. What most of you would want is to print the payroll by employer or by provider, so you can have a payroll printout similar to the screen that we just saw before. Some of you will want to export to ADP, and when you do, you'll automatically get a download file that allows you to export that to ADP. Same thing if you use like PayChoice. If you use another payroll processor that allows for imports into your system, we can work with you when we set up the appointment to turn on your payroll module. You can export to Excel as well. And whenever you're done, you'll just hit this Save button, and it'll tell you that it's been saved. And then you can just click this View Payroll option, and there we will give you a printout of all of the information that was included on your payroll. So let me show you how to get to that later. If you ever want to come back to it, you can go to Payroll, View Previous Payroll, and you'll see a list of the previous payrolls that you've put into the software system. And those that were created using this new feature, the new payroll module, you can just click on that pay run. We tell you what the payroll ID number was because we keep track of a unique number per payroll. But in addition, we give you some really neat summary information. So for our payroll right now, the one I just ran, I know that I spent $50 on tasks, $860 on timesheets, $215 on visits, and so it gave me a total of $1,125. For this particular pay run, all of those were allocated to my PDN provider office. If I ran a full corporate payroll, I would have each of those branch offices listed out here so I could see exactly how my branches stacked up against each other payroll-wise. I also have it summarized by category, so I can see that I paid $50 for in-services, I paid $860 for timesheets, and I paid $215 for skilled nursing services. And so this would give me a list. If I'm a therapy company, I may see physical therapy versus occupational therapy versus speech therapy. I may see OASIS admission visits versus OASIS or skilled nursing routine visits. So it gives me a really neat cost allocation by category. And then it also gives me cost allocation by type. So I know I paid $50 in bonuses. I paid $15 in unallocated expenses. I paid $200 in regular time. $511 in weekend bonus time, and I paid $349 on task type information. And then down at the bottom, I can actually get my full details of what's taken place. And so by employee, I can click on the employee link and see what I paid that employee, again, by type. And so bonus, regular, weekend. I can click to on this details link. So if I wanted to see what that bonus time was for, I could click the view details by type, and it's going to give me a list of all of the bonuses that were paid for that particular employee. Or I can click this full details link, and it will give me a list of everything I paid that employee for. So if you want a detailed printout, you can have that here. You can get very similar information off those printouts when you actually run the payroll the first time. But anytime later on, if you wanted to go back and analyze, let's say an employee calls in and says you forgot to pay them for a particular visit, it's very easy to look that up. You can see exactly what was paid, again, by the type of activity. Let's say an employee said you were supposed to pay them a bonus, but you didn't. It's as easy as going back to that employee, let's say, look at the bonus section, and we can see, okay, we did pay you a bonus. It was for the in-service that was conducted on 6/6. And so it's very easy to track down and allocate cost and view how you've allocated cost on that actual pay run. And so from that point on, we're effectively done with our payroll process. We can run that as often as we need, again, based upon what's been approved and based upon what's ready to be included in payroll. We can have as many payroll periods as we need. So in closing, if you would like to set up an appointment with a customer service representative in order to get your questions answered, in order to get set up for a payroll run, we can do that. Excuse me. And so, yes, you just simply call in and set up an appointment, or you can send in a support ticket. If you just go to Help, Support Tickets, you can send in a support ticket asking for someone to contact you to set up a time to turn on this new payroll module. Make sure you give us your name and your phone number, who we need to contact there, and we'll be more than happy to get in touch with you to set up a time period for turning on this new payroll module for you. Anyway, hopefully you enjoyed this particular training. This will be recorded and posted live within the next few days, so you can share this with your staff. But for now, we appreciate your time and your attendance, and we wish you all the best of luck. Take care.